3 days before my doctoral hooding ceremony, my mother called me to say she wouldn't be coming. Not because she was sick. Not because of a flight she couldn't change or a work emergency she couldn't avoid. She called to tell me that my brother's rec league baseball tournament was that same weekend, and the family had already made plans, and she hoped I understood. I stood in my apartment kitchen, holding the phone against my ear long after she hung up. The pasta I'd been stirring was stuck to the bottom of the pot. I didn't move for probably 4 minutes. I just stood there with the wooden spoon in my hand, listening to nothing. I'd been working on my dissertation for 6 years, 6 years of 4 a.m. mornings, of adjuncting 3 courses a semester to cover my stipend gap, of eating cereal for dinner because I was too exhausted to cook anything real. 6 years of calling home every Sunday and hearing my mother ask how Lucas's batting average was doing before she asked how my research was going. And now, 3 days before the single most important moment of my academic life, she was choosing a rec league baseball tournament. Lucas was 31 years old. I want to be honest about something before I tell the rest of this story. I am not someone who cries easily. I grew up in a house where crying was considered a form of weakness, and I internalized that in ways I'm still unpacking with my therapist. But that night, alone in my kitchen with burned pasta and my phone face down on the counter, I cried. Not the pretty kind. The ugly, gasping kind that you're embarrassed about even when no one can see you. Then I washed my face, threw out the pasta, and started making a plan. My name is not important to this story. What's important is that I was 31 years old. I had spent the last 6 years earning a PhD in public health epidemiology from a state research university in the Pacific Northwest, and I was about to become the first person in my family to earn a doctoral degree. My mother had an associate's degree from a community college. My father had a high school diploma. Lucas had started 2 different bachelor's programs and finished neither. For a long time, I thought my family was proud of me. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that what they actually felt was something closer to discomfort. My mother's name was Sandra. My brother's name was Lucas. His wife was a woman named Britt who had, over 7 years of marriage, become my mother's de facto 3rd child. The preferred one, if I'm being precise. Britt was the one who got the phone calls when there was good news. Britt was the one my mother consulted before making any family decision. Britt was the one who had given my mother 2 grandchildren, which, in my mother's value system, was the closest thing to sainthood available to a civilian. I had given my mother a bound copy of my dissertation. She used it as a doorstop. I found that out from Lucas, actually. He mentioned it the way you mention something completely unremarkable. Mom's using your book thing to keep the back door open. He said it in the same tone he'd used to say the dishwasher was running. I smiled and said, "Oh, that's funny." Later I went to my car and sat in it for 10 minutes before I could drive. The hooding ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in June. My department held it separately from the university-wide commencement because we had 12 doctoral graduates that year, and the department chair, a woman named Dr. Okonkwo, believed we deserved our own moment. It was held in the main auditorium of the public health building. There would be maybe 300 people there, faculty, family members, fellow graduates. Each doctoral candidate was given 8 guest tickets. I had used 4 of them. My college roommate, Jess, was flying in from Denver. My lab mate and closest friend during grad school, a man named Tobias, would be there with his husband, and I had given 1 ticket to a woman named Dr. Hargrove. Dr. Hargrove had been my AP biology teacher in high school. She was the first person who had ever told me I was capable of real scientific thinking. I was 16 years old and I had turned in a lab report that went about 4 pages beyond what she'd asked for, and instead of telling me to rein it in, she'd stayed after class and spent 40 minutes talking to me about research methodology and the difference between correlation and causation. She had written my college recommendation letter. She had written my graduate school recommendation letter. She had driven 4 hours from the small town in southern Oregon, where she'd retired to be in that auditorium. She was 73 years old. She took the train the last 2 hours because her night vision wasn't good enough for mountain driving after dark. She arrived the evening before the ceremony, and I picked her up from the station. She was smaller than I remembered. People shrink, I know that, but it still surprises you every time. She had a rolling suitcase and a gift bag, and she hugged me in the station lobby and said, "I wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world, sweetheart. Not for anything." I had to look away. I pretended I was checking for traffic. That night we had dinner at a Thai place near my apartment. She asked me everything. She asked about my dissertation, what the central argument was, what surprised me most in the data, what I thought the policy implications were. She listened to my answers, she asked follow-up questions, she remembered things I'd mentioned in emails from 2 years ago. At one point, she reached across the table and put her hand on mine and said, "Your parents must be so proud of you." I nodded and changed the subject. The morning of the ceremony, I woke up at 6 and couldn't go back to sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about my mother, which I knew was pointless but couldn't stop. I thought about how she'd sounded on the phone, not apologetic exactly, more like someone explaining a scheduling conflict with a dentist appointment. She'd said, "You know how important Lucas's games are to him." As if I'd somehow forgotten. As if the entire architecture of my childhood hadn't been built around making sure I never forgot. Lucas played baseball from the time he was 5 years old. Every weekend from March through August for 26 years of my life had been organized around his games. I missed birthday parties, school dances, a class trip to Washington, D.C., and my own high school graduation ceremony. They drove me to school and picked me up from the parking lot afterward, while the rest of my class walked across the stage, because Lucas had a playoff game that day. I had driven myself to my college graduation and sat alone in the family section. I told myself I was past being hurt by it. Therapists will tell you that's not how it works. They're right. I got dressed in my apartment bathroom. The regalia was hanging on the back of the door, the black gown, the velvet-trimmed hood in my department's colors, the tam. I'd rented it for the day. I stood in front of the mirror and took a long look at myself and said out loud to no one, "You did this yourself." Then I drove to campus. The auditorium filled up quickly. Families came in with flowers and balloons and those enormous foam board signs with their graduate's face on them. I watched from the staging area as people settled into seats, scanning for the particular configuration of empty chairs that would mark my section of the audience. Jess was already there. I could see her from the doorway. She'd worn a dress and actually done her hair, which for Jess was formal wear. Tobias and his husband Martin were in the row behind her. And there, at the end of the row, in a green blazer she'd bought for the occasion, was Dr. Hargrove. 4 seats in a row. That was my whole section. I'd left the other 4 tickets unused, rather than explain to anyone why I had them. The ceremony started. Dr. Okonkwo gave the opening remarks, and she said something that I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "What you have done here is not just personal. Every one of you has extended the frontier of human knowledge. You have added something to what we know that was not there before you. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the most significant thing a person can do with their mind." I was sitting in the 4th chair from the left in the doctoral candidates row, and I felt something loosen in my chest when she said that. Like a knot I hadn't known was there. They called us up in alphabetical order. When my name was called, I stood up and walked to the stage, and I heard Jess make a sound that I can only describe as a controlled scream. The kind you make when you're in a formal setting, but your best friend is walking across a stage with a doctoral hood, and you cannot fully contain yourself. I heard Tobias and Martin clapping, and I heard, cutting through all of it with perfect clarity, Dr. Hargrove. She stood up. She was the only person in the audience who stood up. She stood up, this 73-year-old woman in a green blazer, and she started clapping before I even reached the steps to the stage, and she didn't stop. I looked out at the audience as Dr. Okonkwo placed the hood over my head, and I found her face in the crowd immediately. She was crying. Not the controlled, dabbing kind. She was actually crying, holding her program against her chest, and clapping like her life depended on it. I made it through the rest of the ceremony on something that felt like autopilot. I shook hands. I smiled for photos. I held the diploma in the right hand and angled my body correctly for the department photographer. I did all of it. But in the back of my mind, behind all of it, I was holding onto that image. A woman who drove 4 hours and took a train through mountain passes and bought a new blazer, standing up in a silent auditorium before anyone else even moved. Afterward, there was a reception in the lobby outside the auditorium. Long tables with food, the kind of spread a university puts out that is technically fine and completely unmemorable. Fruit platters and mini sandwiches and sparkling water. Families clustered around their graduates with flowers. Someone had a balloon arrangement that kept hitting the light fixture. It was loud and warm and a little chaotic, and I loved it. We found a corner and the 5 of us stood together, me, Jess, Tobias, Martin, and Dr. Hargrove. She had gotten herself a cup of sparkling water and was holding it with both hands, still slightly flushed from crying, and she looked more genuinely happy than anyone I'd seen in years. She asked Tobias about his research. She asked Martin what he did. She remembered that Jess had been my roommate and asked about her work in environmental consulting. She held court in that corner like a woman who had spent 40 years teaching teenagers and genuinely liked every one of them. At some point, Dr. Okonkwo came over to congratulate me, and I introduced Dr. Hargrove. I said, "This is the teacher who made me want to do this." Dr. Okonkwo shook her hand with both of hers and said, "Then we owe you a debt." Dr. Hargrove laughed and said she did the work. I just pointed at it. I was fine, right up until she said that. Then I had to turn around and look very intently at the fruit platter for about 30 seconds. The reception lasted about an hour and a half. As it wound down, people started gathering coats and leftover flowers. A few of my cohort were heading to a bar nearby, and they invited me along. I said I'd catch up later. I had something else to take care of first. My phone had been on silent all day. I'd made that decision deliberately the night before. The ceremony would not be interrupted by anything real or anticipated. When I turned it back on as the lobby cleared, there were 11 notifications. 2 were from Lucas. A photo of himself in baseball pants with a thumbs up captioned "We won," and a follow-up that said "Mom said to tell you congrats" or whatever. 1 was from my mother. It was a text that read, "How did it go? Did they give you a certificate?" The other 8 were from an email chain, a thread I'd set in motion 8 months earlier. Here's the part of this story I haven't told yet. 6 months into my doctoral program, I learned something. I learned it by accident, the way you learn most things that break you open. I was helping my mother consolidate some old paperwork during a holiday visit, going through a filing cabinet in the hallway, and I found a letter. It was from the financial aid office of my undergraduate university, dated from my sophomore year. It was addressed to my mother, and it was a confirmation of a change to my financial aid account. Specifically, it was confirming that the bank account associated with my student refund disbursements had been updated. The account it had been updated to was not mine. I didn't say anything that day. I took a photo of the letter on my phone and drove home and spent 3 days telling myself I'd misread it. Then I requested my full disbursement history from my undergraduate institution. The record showed that over 4 years, a total of roughly $24,000 in student refund checks, money disbursed after tuition was paid, meant for housing, books, and living expenses, had been rerouted to an account I had never authorized. I had worked 2 jobs all 4 years of college. I had assumed when money was tight that I was just bad at budgeting. I'd eaten ramen and skipped the campus bookstore and bought my textbooks from a third-party seller with a 3-week shipping delay. I had done all of that while $24,000 of my student refund money sat in someone else's account. I consulted a lawyer. I consulted the university's student accounts office. I consulted a higher education financial aid compliance specialist I found through my program's alumni network. What had happened was, in technical terms, a misappropriation of federal student aid funds. There were remedies available. The process was not fast and it was not comfortable, but there were remedies. I spent 4 years quietly, carefully, building that case. I did it without telling a single member of my family. I did it during the evenings when I should have been sleeping. I did it while continuing to go home for Christmas and say grace at the dinner table and ask my mother how her book club was going. I did it the same way I'd done everything else in my life, alone, without acknowledgement, and to a standard higher than anyone expected. By the time my doctoral ceremony was scheduled, the case had been reviewed, documented, and referred. The formal resolution came through the previous November, a repayment agreement signed with a payment schedule attached. There were no criminal charges because the lawyer advised against pursuing that route and I agreed. But there was a paper trail, there was a formal acknowledgement, there was a number on a document with my name on it and my name on the account where it would eventually be repaid. The email chain I'd been watching on my phone was a thread with my lawyer and the university's compliance office. The final confirmation that the first payment in the repayment schedule had been received and recorded had come through that morning. While I was sitting in the auditorium in my doctoral regalia watching Dr. Hargrove cry, the first installment of what my family owed me had been transferred into an account I'd opened specifically for this purpose. I didn't tell my mother that day. I let her text about the certificate sit unanswered. I told her 3 weeks later in a letter, not an email, an actual letter, typed and printed and mailed with a return receipt. I told her what I had found, what I had done, and what the current status was. I told her that the process was complete and that I had no desire to revisit it in conversation. I told her that I loved her, because I did, in the complicated and battered way you love someone who has been both your mother and your wound for your entire life. I told her that I was not interested in her explanation and that I was not asking for an apology. I told her that the matter was resolved and that I would be taking some time before I was ready to speak again. Then I went and had dinner with Jess, who had stayed an extra 3 days because she knew me well enough to know I would need someone around. I don't know what my mother did when she got the letter. I don't know if she called Lucas. I don't know if she cried or got angry or went very quiet. I thought for a long time that I wanted to know, that having that information would give me something, some feeling of completion. But sitting with Jess at a restaurant 2 blocks from my apartment, eating a meal I had absolutely no anxiety about paying for, I realized I didn't actually need to know. It had already happened. I had already been there for it, even if she hadn't. Jess reached across the table and said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a real minute. "Like the front door is open," I said, "and the back is closed." She nodded like she understood. She did understand. That's what 6 years of friendship gets you. Dr. Hargrove called me 2 days after the ceremony. She'd made it home safely, she said. She wanted to make sure I knew that she had put a photo from that day, one Martin had taken, in a frame on her desk, next to the photos of her own children and grandchildren. She said she'd been telling everyone. She said, "I knew when you were 16 years old that you were going to do something important. I just had to wait to find out what it was." I told her that I'd found out because she'd pointed at it. She laughed. Then she said, "Come visit me sometime, I have a guest room." I told her I would. I meant it. That was a year ago. I'm writing this now because someone asked me recently, a younger woman in my department, a first-year PhD student who is the first in her family too, she asked me what the hardest part of getting a doctorate was. She expected me to say the dissertation defense, or the funding gaps, or the isolation of the final year. I said, learning that the people who are supposed to show up sometimes won't, and that showing up for yourself in the end is the only thing that actually counts. She wrote it down. I watched her write it down in the margins of her lab notebook, the same way I used to take notes in the margins of things in high school. In Dr. Hargrove's classroom, the day I first understood that I had a mind worth using. Some people come into your life and tell you who you can be. They don't always look like parents. They don't always share your last name. They don't always fill the chairs you reserved for them. But they stand up when your name is called. That's the only thing I needed to know.